Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claudine Kennicott, and I am one of the 5 regional support leads for Nebraska MTSS, as well as a part of the Summit Planning Committee. We are very excited to have you joining us today for Day 2 of our Nebraska MTSS Virtual Summit. We recognize that you as educators are potentially experiencing some uncertainty and or anxiety at this time, but are thrilled that you have chosen to participate in this very important learning experience. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Jamie Harris to all of you, and would like to take a moment to share some of her background information. Jamie is a school psychologist with over 15 years of experience supporting the needs of students, parents, and educators, helping to build multi-tiered systems of support for students with a particular interest in social-emotional learning and mental health. She was a national nominee and was awarded the Wisconsin School Psychologist of the Year in 2014. Jamie is the co-founder of EduClimber, an award-winning MTSS data collaboration and visualization tool, and a senior product manager at Illuminate Education, where she has consulted and trained districts across the nation to build capacity in their understanding of MTSS through practical applications of data. She is certainly no stranger to Nebraska, and we are so fortunate to have her sharing her message with us today, entitled Addressing SEL Through Data-Driven MTSS to Support the Whole Child. And I do know that we will be monitoring the chat and the question and answer section on Zoom. So if you have some things that you would like to ask about, we will pause a little at the end of the presentation and take a look at some of those questions. So without further ado, welcome, Jamie.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction. And you got to see a little bit of the experience that I have here, and it's my absolute pleasure to be here with you today. I wish I was there in person, but I hope everybody is staying safe and well in Nebraska. I'm here in Wisconsin. As you see here, I worked in a rural area here in southern Wisconsin as a school psychologist, and I'm happy to share some of my experiences. So what I'm planning on covering today is, first of all, we'll start with the use of data, right? So data is one of the most important things that we have in our arsenal. And I'll be talking about how we can continue to use data throughout the discussion. We also want to cover the importance of school climate and school culture, especially in today's world. Also then taking a look at the MTSS framework, really through the lens of equity as well as SEL. Then we'll take a look into the measurement types. So we know why the work is so important and what the work is, and so really give you a glimpse into like the practical kind of components of the different ways that you can measure some of these things that'll help fuel really your practice. So moving then from like the theoretical kind of level to what are those practical applications that hopefully you can begin using right away. And then again, at the end, I will be taking and making some time for questions. So happy to have those come in as you have them, and we'll try to circle back to them throughout the conversation or at the very end. So I wanted to begin by just showing, I'm sure you all are very familiar with the problem-solving process, but again, throughout everything that we do, we want to be sure that we are looking at data, identifying what the problems are, right? Analyzing what it is that we can really do, and then formulate that plan. Then take that time to implement the plan, and then always come back. And to me, data is embedded in every one of these steps. This is really funny because a couple of years ago, I was looking for a great way to visualize the problem-solving model, as we were discussing at Illuminate, how it's trying to explain MTSS and how it fits with the problem-solving model. And it's funny because I stumbled on your website for the Nebraska MTSS, and I was like, this is perfect. So I'm completely honored to be sharing and showcasing something that I used with some districts. So nice work on that. So continuing here, as you know, I loved this visualization as well, but the framework is really built for success, right? And it's all stemmed around having a strong foundation, as we know. So just like when we're building a house, everything starts with that strong foundation. And in this case, really focusing on the problem-solving model, right? And then you'll also notice here scheduling for intervention and how should we look at intervention this year in particular, and then also making sure that we're using reliable and good data is at the core of what we need to do. And without that, the actual things that we do with students can really fall apart very quickly if we don't have a strong foundation. So I also just wanted to share, to me, there's kind of two parts of data, regardless of it being very reliable and valid, which we certainly know is the case. But highlighting, there are two different types of data in my mind. So we have the qualitative data and we have the quantitative data. So qualitative data to me is really the stuff that we know or we believe or we think. So it's kind of like the gut of, as an educator, you know in your experience that a student has a difficulty or has a problem area or has strengths or weaknesses, and you can feel that sort of, right? So that's that qualitative information, which should never be overlooked. So there's also the importance, right, of using quantitative data. So what is it that we can actually measure with students? So as I'm talking through today, I just wanted to share a brief story, actually, about why it's so important to have both qualitative data as well as quantitative data. So if we look at this, this is the qualitative data on this student. The student has a 4.0, 100% attendance, never misses school. Top 10% of the class, was in National Honor Society, varsity sports, Student Leadership Council, was in many clubs and organizations. But what we didn't see through this data was that this student was actually struggling. This is actually me, if you didn't already place it. I had depression in high school, and am happy to share that I can appropriately cope and manage all stresses that kind of come my way. But at this time, I had significant depression and was suicidal. The person who made the difference for me, who caught that I was struggling, didn't do it by looking at my data. He knew me. It was my Phy Ed teacher. And he sent a message to the school psychologist at my high school and said, hey, something's up with Jamie. I don't know. She's always just attentive and doing what she needs to do. Can somebody check in with her? And fortunately, the school psychologist did so. I was hospitalized, but I'm obviously happy to share that experience now has led me down a completely different path. I became a school psychologist because I was so grateful that the person took time for me. And I wanted to share or potentially be that person for a student to just pay it forward. So I think it's really important that we always think about the data in many ways. Additionally, I come from a family. My parents are still married. I have 3 siblings, all of whom are still married. And I'm a white woman, so I had a lot of, protective factors, so to speak. And I was struggling, and without somebody paying attention and being connected to me and knowing me, I would have been dead. So I hope that whatever you're taking out of today, one of the most important things we can do as educators is to make a connection with students. And connection can make all the difference for students. And it's especially important that we think about connection as part of our overall school climate and the culture of our schools in today's world. So I'm going to jump right into discussion about what is social emotional learning, what is social emotional behavior, and then tying in a little bit of mental health as well into this discussion. So I'm starting with showcasing here. I hope everyone has seen this. If not, Castle is the resource for this. But a good definition, right, of social emotional learning is that the process of us as both educators or adults, as well as children, being able to understand and manage those emotions, set and achieve positive goals for ourselves, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. So all of these are really those skills that we're expecting and hoping that our students can have so that they can become successful in life. So what I like about this visualization is right, that all of these skills are really wrapped inside of our classroom environment and in our schools and in our home and community, because all of these things play a critical role in ensuring that our students are in fact learning those important social emotional skills that will be needed for life. So on the flip of that, so what's social emotional behavior? So social emotional behavior, or the functioning, is really defined by two different things. So one is that we have the presence of positive social emotional skills and the skills that help students learn. So these are the types of things that we would expect and hope that our students were actually able to observe and to see them doing. So we hope that they're self-aware and that they have the skills to become self-aware, that they have the social awareness skills of what's going on around them. And, ooh, it looks like, Ricky is pretty sad today. So what can I do? Also self-management, being able to maintain your own control of behavior, relationship skills, so knowing how to engage appropriately with other students, so seeing them actually go up and maybe make eye contact or initiate conversation. Those are those types of things that are going to be important and that we're hoping that our students have if they have positive social emotional behavioral skills, as well as being motivated and being engaged academically. So again, visually, you can see that a student is engaged if they're nodding or if they're taking notes, and then also study skills. So those things that our students, we're hoping that they can learn. On the flip of that, right, so it's the absence of disruptive behaviors that really get in the way of our students being able to learn and have those healthy relationships that we're hoping that they attain. So the types of behaviors often that we see that we kind of associate as maladaptive is when a student becomes more aggressive, or we're seeing elevated levels of aggression. And that could be physical, or that could just be verbal as well. So looking also at, is the student doing what we're hoping, or are they following directions appropriately? So what is their compliance level like? And so often we see that students who have some levels of risk with their social emotional behavior often have higher or elevated rates of non-compliance. We often see that these students are more disruptive, and that is, of course, blurting, or sometimes impulsivity comes into this kind of picture. Also, we see that students that have an area of need here, that they are often more sad, that they kind of have issues with understanding words and how to appropriately use their words with other people. So that's a great skill that you can teach directly, is when you get upset, to be able to communicate effectively. Also looking at those internalizing problems, right? So being students who we see as being worried or fearful, as well as withdrawal, so disengaging from things that we would have normally seen these students doing. So you can kind of see there's some undertones of those types of behaviors that we would expect out of a student or an individual who is mentally healthy. So kind of taking a peek at this, from the lens of SEB, this helps us to really identify what are those particular skills and those areas that we really want to target, either identify and then also target when we're working directly with students as part of our overall SEL approach with students. So think about the behavior as those things that we see, and think about the learning aspect as the thing that we're hoping that students can achieve. So the other thing I just want to throw out there is that you can achieve positive skills in SEL through a positive school climate and school culture. So again, knowing that these are the essential elements that you have in Nebraska, which again, kudos to your state stakeholders and leaders here, because very thoughtful, dead on, accurate description of those key important elements for MTSS. Likewise, it was interesting. So like I said a while back, we were looking at what are those components that I see across the nation. So we know, or I know that students or schools, right? Everybody has kind of different things that they do, different systems in place, different policies in place, and that varies from district to district as well, and then from state to state. So every state has kind of incorporated their own kind of like MTSS components. And so what we did at Illuminate was we took a look at what's happening across the nation and tried to come up with a story to help all districts kind of see what are those key essential components. And what you had is very similar, right? You're seeing the same themes are present here with the components that I also, we helped kind of create for all customers of our products. And that is stems around inviting climate and culture. And so we see that schools that are successful or have successful MTSS systems, these are the schools that have a positive, inviting climate and culture. They have a very thoughtful thought leadership in place, and they are very intentional about ensuring that the infrastructure and the systems that are in place are integrated, and that we're not looking at a student in a silo, or we're not looking at behavior, because we know behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum. So making sure that we're integrating all of our like essential policies and practices holistically. Also knowing that we need to engage with our family and student and community stakeholders. Those schools that are doing this are having great outcomes. Likewise, if we are noticing that our students have levels of need, we first need to verify that through data and the use of data. And so then matching students' instruction and level of intervention potentially based on the assessments and the data that we have. So this is, again, one of the most important things is that we're kind of looking at all of this, but today I wanted to focus on that inviting climate and culture. So there's a lot of definitions, or like maybe mixed understanding about what is climate and culture. That was always for me early on in my career, something I kind of struggled with, like, what's the difference between these things? And so school climate really just refers to the physical, social, and emotional environment, or what I think are like just the feel that you get when you walk into a school. And what's interesting is that can be different for different people. So as a white girl who had depression, the feel that I had was different, likely, than maybe my older brother who had a different experience. So everybody can perceive that feeling a little bit differently. And so I'll get into it a little bit later, but it's really important that we gather data around that so that we can really start to understand what is the school climate according to multiple stakeholders. So school climate is really the result of many factors, but it can be summed up as how engaged students are by teachers, how welcomed they are by their peers, and how invested their family is in helping them achieve their best. I believe that every parent wants the best for their child. I think every parent has not necessarily been equipped with how to do that. So our job as educators is to help support that and to identify where areas of strength and weakness, and using the school climate. If we aren't welcoming our families, if they feel threatened to come to school, maybe they had a bad experience at school themselves, so they tend to think about school in a negative way. That's really important for us to know, because it's something that we can help change, and we can try to help welcome them and really bridge that gap, and maybe change their feelings about their school environment. Additionally, ESSA has had kind of bubbled school climate up to the surface, and it requires now that we have that school quality and student success piece in statewide accountability systems. And so often we see that includes student engagement, attendance, educator engagement, school climate and safety, and then other factors that are all just so important to our students' academic well-being and overall success. On the flip, what is culture? So school culture typically refers to the long-term physical and social environment, as well as the values or beliefs of the school shared across individuals. And the climate, to me, is something that is the attitude or the mood of the school, and the culture is kind of the personality or the values. So climate is kind of the here's what I feel, here's how I kind of perceive things. That's something that can be changed and can be not manipulated, but can be modified more easily than the culture. The culture is like your schema. It's your backbone. It's kind of who you are. So a school climate can be more easily changed than the school culture. That typically takes longer to change the school culture. So again, climate is perception-based, while culture is grounded in shared values and beliefs. So we need to make sure that we're addressing all of those things. So making sure that we identify that, yes, we care about kids and that we're here for our students. That's the culture. The climate is when those kids walk in our door, how do they feel? And so the ways that we can really kind of frame this up, this comes from the U.S. Department of Ed. So the components that we tend to see or that are visible in almost any of the different climate surveys that exist are engagement, safety, and environment. And so we'll kind of unpack these a little bit here. So relationships are going to be not only the relationships that our students have with educators, but also the relationships that they have with other students. Do they feel like they can go to somebody if they're upset? It's really that connection piece that we're seeing with relationships. Additionally, our relationships will be able to see this, like if I, as a school psychologist, have a teacher or the school counselor next door who I feel like I can really talk with, I'm more likely to be in a better place to be able to better support my students. So it's not just relationships with students, it's relationships across the whole environment in the school. Looking at diversity, we need to recognize when we have implicit bias, and it's not just implicit bias or bias against somebody's race or difference, but really being able to recognize that that you don't maybe know a lot about, for example, what are we going to do when the students are back, and what do we do if we see that these students have needs and we don't know what to do? Well, it's a diverse situation, and we need to understand that, recognize that, and admit when we need help. So with implicit bias, so if we have a tendency to think that students with IEPs don't make as much progress, that's a bias you might have, and it's something that you need to recognize and kind of do a check on yourself to see whether you're changing your behavior as a result of that bias. So making sure that we're able to do that and then have that respect for diversity, because diversity is what makes us who we are. So being able to kind of measure that's going to be an important thing. Also looking at school participation. So this is more than just attendance. This is how engaged are students. Are they wanting to come to school? Going over to safety, we've got a few different things here looking at emotional safety. So when the students are walking into our building and when they're in our classroom, do they feel like they're in a place where they're ready to learn? This is especially important right now. COVID we've all experienced trauma as a result of the changes that kind of are in the current time. What we know about kids who have had trauma, or anybody who's had trauma, is that it changes your brain. And our students who are coming into our classrooms are going to have differences now. And we need to be able to recognize that helping them to feel safe is going to be a very critical piece. So when we think about trauma and the brain and how it's changed, the amygdala has changed, and it sends out like elevated levels of cortisol, right? And so when that happens, you kind of enter this state of flight or fight. In the brain, your frontal lobe, kind of that control center, that thought center, it can't process as much as it could if the amygdala wasn't firing cortisol. So it's like, I'm scared, oh my gosh, something's going to happen. So you're constantly looking around or feeling just threatened. So we need to make sure that we're ensuring when students are walking in our doors that they feel like they're in a safe place. They might not be in our classrooms, but we can certainly make those connections to make them feel like we're supporting them. There's my dogs. So we also have physical safety, which is something that, when they're in our school buildings, we can be sure that they're feeling safe, and we can do something about that if they're not feeling safe. Substance abuse is something that we certainly are seeing an increase of misuse of substances, and the effect that that has on our students is pretty significant. And we also see that some of our students are misusing substances. So these are the types of things that we need to continue to monitor. Looking at our environment, again, our physical environment, making sure that all students are safe in our buildings. And right now, our physical environment will be different. I know here in Wisconsin, all students are required to wear face masks. Desks are moving 6 feet apart. In the lunchroom, students have to face one way, 6 feet apart each. So that's different for them. But what we need to make sure then is that they're still feeling like safe and protected, and that it's not hostile kind of feeling. Looking at an academic environment, so this is again making sure that if our students aren't in the classroom and that we're not ensuring that they're like able to actually be engaged and that our class is set up nicely if they're in a remote kind of setting, making sure that they have access to technology so that they have the ability to access learning. Looking at wellness, I know a lot of schools have been implementing like reduced lunch or like offerings for more than just when they're in school. So trying to do all we can to even engage with outside key stakeholders or community liaisons about ensuring that if we don't have control over the wellness that they have at home, that we're connecting with outside agencies to ensure that students are being taken care of. Lastly, looking at our disciplinary environment. So this is really how do we handle discipline for our students and making sure that they still feel safe. And you can continue to look at disciplinary environment through those kind of responsive practices. So looking at like office disciplinary referrals and then slicing and dicing the data to kind of help us analyze whether we might have some problems there. So looking at all of this, that's a lot to take in. And what's really important in today's environment is that we focus on relationships and the connections we make. That's much easier for an individual to control or to modify or to have an influence on rather. As well as the emotional safety. So if you're doing a good job of greeting students every day, even taking time and like during reestablishing maybe morning meetings and allowing yourselves time to connect with students, they're going to feel safe in the classroom. And then also making sure, again, the academic environment, that these students have access to learning and that they're engaged, and if they feel safe and they feel welcome, that we hope that they feel like they're in a good place for their academic environment as well. So when we unpack, right, school climate, we tend to find that there's the key social, emotional, and wellness kind of elements embedded throughout. What we know is that those elements are currently at risk. And so we really need to make sure that we're focusing on those at-risk school climate elements to help students succeed this year, no matter where learning is taking place. So bringing it back to MTSS and what are those systems that we need to make sure that we're putting into place, looking at it through the lens of both equity and SEL, we can start with data. And so all of this data that we kind of have here is all centered around the child. And so we know children are multifaceted and that it's really important for us to have more than one measure of data or more than one piece of information about a student, because all of this is critical for us to know who is this student? What are their needs? What are their strengths? What are the weaknesses? And how can we help put things in place for them? So these are all of the different types of data that I see schools using and that you can currently use to help you identify levels of need. And they're all centered around academic, social, emotional, behavioral, and then also being able to look at the data through different lenses. So if we know, we have a question that comes up, being able to easily manipulate your data to answer the questions is going to be really important. There's just a couple of these that I'd like to highlight. And so looking specifically at growth, this is going to be a really, it's going to continue to bubble up as a really important piece. In fact, many states have already changed their growth or their accountability systems to be more focused on growth rather than achievement. So make sure that you're looking at national percentile or growth percentile ranks if you're doing screeners, and that those academic screeners have good growth measures and can provide you a national percentile rank. Another piece I just want to mention is direct behavior ratings. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with DBRs, but if we're looking at students' specific SEL skills and what are those targeted behaviors that we want to directly monitor to show that a student is making progress, a direct behavior rating is a really great tool to use to show progress for students like social, emotional, or behavioral skills. So for me, if I had somebody that was doing this when I was in school and was struggling, how do we know if what we're doing is working? They could have easily done a DBR, which is just, you're supposed to do it every day, once a day, and just kind of generally describe at what level was Jamie engaged today. And engagement for me would have looked like I was making eye contact and that I was doing my work. What you would have seen me doing in school was I was leaving the classroom or I was just looking around. I was on medication and it was not a good thing for me. And so they could have seen that intervention wasn't working. So DBRs are a great data source that I would highly recommend people take a look at right now. Also, going up to suspensions, we need to make sure that we're being equitable with our practices. And so if we are noticing trends in our data about different populations of our students who are getting suspended more often from school, that could be there could be something underneath that helps us to recognize that as a system, we might not be as responsive with these students as we might hope. Additionally, looking at a couple other things, the climate surveys are going to be extremely helpful, and I'll get into that in just a moment. But I wanted to point out another piece, which is health office visits. So this is if you are in session and you have students in the school, I would recommend to start kind of categorizing the different the different reasons that students are coming into the health office. So if you can't do a social emotional screener to identify students who have underlying emotional needs, a health office visit for students who are frequently coming in to because they have a headache or a tummy ache and it's repeated. And you can start to, if you group the data correctly, you can start to reveal that you have potentially a systematic problem. So I know for me, when we started tracking this, I had a hunch about that we were having students leave a class very often. And then when we started gathering the information on health office visits, I was seeing that we had a significant number of our students who were leaving during math class. So it helped us to identify that, at a specific time of the day, a lot of our students, when math instruction was happening, were leaving the class and going to the health office or going to visit, any of the kind of helpers that are in the school. So just some important kind of data points for you to consider. The last one I want to identify is the behavior incidents. Often we just think of those as majors and minors. I would, if you have a system, I know EduClimber, which is the tool that my husband built for me so that I could get back to working directly with kids because I was just buried in data. So what I started to do in the school was in EduClimber, we would rate, or we would have the teachers fill out just a general concern. So, hey, I'm concerned about Jamie, for example. And in like the different category types, you could say like, is it a social issue? Is it an emotional concern? What are you concerned about as this teacher? And you can even set up the system so that it sends you automated like notifications that there's something potentially going on with a student. So seeing how often are we having these problems will be very, very helpful. So don't just think about behavior as like a major offense or a minor offense, but really take a look at that like qualitative piece to help you kind of unveil what's actually happening with our students. I just want to highlight the importance of having all of these different types of data. So it's great that we have data in our systems. You can see this is a screenshot from EduClimber, and we just released an update this summer, which I'm super excited about. It's much more user-friendly. But being able to take all of the different data that we have to be able to put the qualitative information alongside that quantitative information is especially important right now when we're already overwhelmed with what are we going to do with students. Being able to come to one place to identify that the students have a need. This for me in district just saved me hours of time. So even if you don't have EduClimber, I'm just showing this is what kind of information we should be looking at when we're making decisions about students. But when we do that, I encourage you to not just focus on one student at a time. We want to think about this very systematically. And so a strong system of comprehensive social, emotional, and behavioral supports is as important as effective teaching to creating those conditions for our learning that's required to help students achieve their academic potential. We know that the academic gap this year is going to be much bigger, and our primary role in education has always been that we want students to succeed academically. Over the past decade, we've already seen that we've identified that students are not the same as they were 10 years ago, and that we need to provide more instruction in the areas of social skills, emotion regulation, and behavior. So making sure that we address the academic gap remains an important objective, but students are not going to be ready to engage in informal learning if they feel physically or psychologically unsafe. So we need to make sure that we're taking the time to really ensure that students are feeling safe when they walk into our buildings, and that's going to probably take a little bit more time than normal, but I want to stress the fact that it's super critical that you all as educators are taking time for self-care, because if our students are coming into an environment and you're not feeling good about anything, talk to your colleagues, talk to your administrator, talk to somebody, because you need to make sure that you're taking care of yourself so that you can be in the place physically, emotionally to help support students. And it's okay to ask for help. When we view our SEL needs through the context of school climate, we start to have a clearer path to using the SEL data to ensure equity. And again, equity is just that access for all students, and that we're making sure that all of our students have access appropriately to develop those social, emotional, academic skills that we hope that they need for life. And equity has been an area that continues to be focused. I know a lot of schools are doing things with culturally responsive practices, so same kind of light here. So we're just trying to make sure that we're removing that predictability of success and failure that currently correlates with race or any other social or cultural factor. And we really want to make sure that we're interrupting the inequitable practices that we sometimes have. Again, examining our own biases that we do have. Everyone has implicit bias about things, but to make sure that that doesn't impact our practice, and if it is, to recognize it and to make those changes when appropriate. But overall, we're trying to create those inclusive, safe, welcoming environments for all students. And then discovering and cultivating the unique gifts that each student has, all of their own talents and interests, and being able to share all those skills that our students are possessing. So to do this, I encourage you to kind of take that equity lens. So always make sure that we're looking at our data from that lens of equity and making sure that all students have access. So school teams need to take that problem-solving approach and address issues of equity that are likely going to be exacerbated by the current situation of our the school closures and the remote learning and all the different things that we're all being faced with, and that will continue probably this upcoming year to continue to be faced with. So I know we need to continue to focus on learning and ensuring that our students are learning, and what are we going to do about that large gap that our students have. But we need to make sure that we stay grounded in our data, and that we continue to focus on that all of our students are growing. And so to ensure that all of our students are growing, we need to be able to slice that data so that all of our efforts are in fact effective and equitable for all students. So for me, data is at the core of everything. And it's also, in this situation, it's the foundation, or it's the underlying factor that's kind of needed. I think about it kind of like a thread. So if we have data, we can start to look at the school climate and the students' social, emotional, behavioral needs through that data. And we know that SEB and climate are a precursor to learning. Those things have to be in place for learning to occur. And we can move into, like, when we start to look at learning, we should be looking at whether that growth is happening for all students. And when we start to look at whether it's happening for all students, we're making sure that we're achieving equity. And that equity will be achieved and will be apparent when all students are in fact growing. So the only way we know any of this is if we have data. So let's take a peek at how we will measure or get the different types of data that are going to be really critical for helping to modify and make changes when appropriate. So there are a number of really great school climate surveys, and I would recommend that you administer those. This is just a visualization of a way that you can see, in which schools do we need to address school climate. So make sure you have your system set up in a way that you can slice the data to look at where are problems or where are their areas of success. One thing I always recommend to schools is to not just focus on the problem, but also look at where are we doing something really well, so that we can maybe replicate that. What's different about that place that they're just excelling versus other schools where maybe we need some support? Because if something's working somewhere, let's use that and continue to learn and get better. So starting and making sure that we can group the data in a way that we can identify areas of need. So the different types of things that you're going to want to consider when you're measuring climate are, first of all, again, you want to make sure that those tools that you're using are in fact valid and reliable, that they're measuring what we said they would, and they've been made in a way that we're actually measuring the question that we're trying to get the answer for. And these valid and reliable school measures should be assessing the students' emotional, physical, and behavioral aspects. You want to assess school climate annually. Typically, you're going to want to do this within the first 45 and the last 45 days of the school year. And the reason it's important in my mind to do it annually, or to do it twice a year rather, is to show the growth over time. This year is going to be particularly challenging. I would give it a little bit of time so everyone has some time to reacclimate. And by the way, our students are resilient, and as long as we have support for each other, we're going to be able to help support our students. But being able to measure where are students at, or what's their kind of perception of the school climate, is going to be particularly important, so that they have the ability to learn like we're hoping that they will. And then at the end of the year, doing that other check to see, if we're not making progress, or if one building made a lot of progress, what did we do? What didn't we do? What can we do better next time? So looking also, I already mentioned this earlier, but again, everybody has a different perception, a different feel when they walk in. So it's really important that we get that feedback through administration of these school climate measures from multiple stakeholders. So you're going to want to engage with parents. Teachers should certainly, again, be taking those climate surveys, and that any staff and also families or community, some school districts are engaging with their community agencies as well to see what the school climate is. Again, never look at data in a silo. Our students, again, are multifaceted, and climate is something that is just one measure. So we want to continue to measure or to analyze the data in kind of in relation to how are students achieving academically, what are our disciplinary practices, and then also how often are our students coming to class. So looking at the data, those four kind of like pieces of data is going to be really important to be able to evaluate and identify areas of need, and to see if we do something here, does it have an impact on something else? And then I always recommend, don't do this as just yet another initiative. Our plates are already full coming back to school, but this is a really easy thing to administer. And but I would encourage you to incorporate this probably into like your tier 1 teams if you have them in place, because again, this is universal. What do we need to do for all of our students? I have linked here to a handful of different climate surveys that have been pretty effective and that are often referenced, just as a note. And I know that you're going to be getting a copy of this recording, so you can reference back to this point here. So when we think about measuring SEB, this is showing a few different things. So if you have a screener in place to be able to show how many of our students are at risk and how many of our students are not at risk on a specific social emotional behavioral screener is really, really important. And remember that kind of 20% rule. So if we see that greater than 20% of our students have a level of need in some area, so if we're seeing that there's high levels of risk for more than 20% of our students, that is an indication to us that we need to change something at the universal level. And when we think about that, you kind of want to think about it through 3 different kind of ways. One is at the school level. Are we seeing that as an entire school system that we have greater than 20% of our students having a need? Same thing at a grade level. If not at the school level, let's look at the grade levels. Do we have a group of students who are struggling, who could all benefit from social emotional behavioral instruction? And then also looking at the individual classrooms to be able to slice your data again in those kind of 3 categories will be particularly important as we start to identify that students are in need. So to do that work, we need to make sure, again, that our tools are valid and reliable, and also that they're brief. We don't want teachers to be spending a lot of time doing this and gathering information. There's also some teacher nomination procedures out there, but I would encourage you to just consider if you can't administer a social emotional behavioral screener, you could also consider doing a connectedness survey. That's an easy thing for you to do, to be able to say to students, do you feel connected to somebody at school? Because if somebody doesn't feel connected to somebody, they're definitely at risk. However, I will say that a good SEB screener, I would strongly recommend Sabres, which is a tool that I used in district that FastBridge incorporated and now is part of the Illuminate family of products. But certainly look at something that's valid and reliable, because we know with Sabres in particular that there's a high level of like predictability on academic outcomes for those students. We also know that 1 in 5 students right now tend to have a level of need. So this year, we have to make sure that we're really looking at our data. I will say, don't administer your SEB screeners right away. Give it about a month or 2 before you start doing that, because the environment has shifted and changed, and it does take time for students to kind of reacclimate. And we need to make sure that when our teachers, for example, are filling out the questionnaires, or our students are filling out those questionnaires through the screener, that we're getting accurate information. So giving it some time is really important, as well as just generally, we're going to have an influx of students' level of need, right? So being able to give it a little bit of time and figure out what do we need to do universally, because it's likely going to be that there's going to be class-wide intervention, or we're going to need to add like 20 minutes a day, change our schedules a little bit to incorporate more like human interaction and instruction in SEL, is likely going to be an important thing. But give it a little bit of time before you do that so you can ensure that the data that you're getting are accurate. Always have to point out, right, that weighing the pig, they say, doesn't make it any fatter. In this case, if we identify that students have a need, do we have something in place to help support them? There's a lot out there. You've got to make sure that you're getting consent or assent, right? And making sure that these students are, that we have things in place if we identify that there's a level of need, as well as letting the parents know. And being able to be a partner with our parents is going to be especially critical. So we need to take that systematic lens on SEB, because there will be higher levels of need this year. And so looking at things more from that universal perspective is going to be important. Also looking at our growth measures, I just want to point out, this is again another screenshot from the system that my husband made, but if you don't have that, looking at the data from this kind of like the question, which is what we're doing actually working, and how do we know? So a lot of the accountability systems are moving more from trying to increase levels of growth. So in this case, at the beginning of the year, we could see that of this school, we had 456 students who were at high risk. If we still have 456 students at high risk at the end of the year or at the midpoint, what we're doing is not working. So we need to make sure that we're moving students out of that like high level of risk and into other areas. And this is just a really easy way for you to be able to visualize that information. Also just want to throw out there, this is being able to take multiple sets of data to see growth over time. So from the fall to the winter to the spring on various measures across various types of data. So not just looking at academic skills, but also on the SEB, if you're able to give that from fall to winter to spring, being able to see growth over time for groups of our students, it's going to be helpful and important to kind of group your data in an organized fashion. Also measuring our equity. In this case, using this tool helps to identify that our students, I've grouped it by ethnicity, and I've kind of sliced it and said, show me the students who have 2 or more incidents and have a attendance rate that is at a certain point. So that now I can look at, are we being equitable with our practices? And what's the percentage of our students who have, whatever the data set is that you're looking at? And then again, being able to group that information. So here you can see I've grouped it by who are our students overall, like what's the distribution of the student population that we're working with? How are they performing? And which students are in interventions, and do we know whether those interventions are in fact effective? Also, I don't know if everyone has access to some sort of risk ratio calculation, but specifically looking at our students' incident rates. And in this case, looking at levels of disproportionality with like levels of suspension. So we can see that our Black or African American students are 1.5 times more likely to be suspended than than the control value, which is in this case white. So looking at the data from this kind of like lens and thinking about those kinds of questions, make sure that we're being equitable with our practices. And this is an easy way to kind of look at that data. And then lastly, how do we support those students' social emotional learning and SEB through those equitable practices? And it really kind of, for me, lands in these 3 buckets. So if you've got PBIS, which I'm assuming most of you are incorporating some sort of PBIS, which has been around now for decades, but really proactively teaching and reinforcing the students' positive, healthy, successful behaviors. Also giving specific instruction for students' social skills. So looking specifically at those interpersonal skills, survival skills, problem-solving skills, and also like, can they if they get into a conflict with a peer, can they work through that? I don't know if one thing I implemented that I would highly recommend in a middle school or high school setting, this was a systematic approach because we had an elevated rate of chronic absenteeism and drug abuse in our district. And so we incorporated steps A. So it's a DBT. It's founded in DBT kind of practices, but it incorporates like mindfulness and interpersonal skill instruction. And we had amazing success implementing that. I would look it up. It's steps A. And then also emotion regulation. So making sure that we're trying to increase those positive habits and identify and decrease negative responses to behavior. So these are kind of those 3 areas that we can really focus on every day with our students. And it doesn't need to be a whole program like I just mentioned. Simple little things that you do with students make a big difference. So the key ideas I'm hoping you take away today are that the Tier 1 supports that we're putting in place for our students are going to be critical, and that they should be provided to all of our students, and that we can't intervene our way out of restoring lost learning. Connection is going to be key this year. Students need to know they have someone to count on at school, whether it's remote or on-site. And also ensuring that, we want to focus on those academic skills, but we do need to change the expectations about what students should be able to know and do, and how much growth we can expect within a year. And giving ourselves the permission that that's okay. So with that, I wanted to thank you. If you had any questions, or want to connect with me at any point, I'm going to reference you to Adam, who is, Claudine knows Adam, and I'm sure many of you on the call know Adam, but a great advocate for students and for doing what's right for kids. But he can be your connection point for any questions you might have, or to learn more about the tools that I was kind of showcasing today. And with that, Claudine, were there any questions?
Yes, wow. Thank you so much, Jamie, for being here with us today and willing to share your personal story. Such a good reminder for how critical it is to make connections with our students. And we certainly appreciate you sharing the ever important message of a positive school climate, along with utilizing multiple sources for database decision making. This deep dive will truly be a benefit for our school leaders and educators across the state. We did have 4 questions, and 2 of them have already been answered. So I will just go ahead and read the other 2, and it looks like there's some more coming in. But one of them was, I believe, on some of the data that you had shared at the end of the presentation, they were asking if that was actual information about a particular student. I'm guessing it was probably just a made-up situation, but wanted to check on that.
Yeah, a lot of the screenshots I was showing are from our system, and it's been like anonymized, but it's typically real data. The information I shared about myself, that was all real, but I don't think that's what the question was.
Yeah. And then the other question, I'll just read it to you. How do schools organize the DBRs? For example, is there an online form into which staff enter their data, or do individual staff members use the data for themselves?
I've seen districts do it in a variety of ways. I know that Sabres, which is part of FAST, has an online component. I've seen some schools use EduClimber to capture that because there's an easy way to enter data that way. And then I've also had it where when I was in district, or in one of the schools where we were gathering this, they would record it on a piece of paper and then they would hand it off to me because I was kind of the data go-to person, to being able to enter that and then help them to understand, okay, are we making growth or not? So a few different ways that you can do it, but I would definitely check out DBR. I can't remember, I think directbehaviorratings.org has some great examples of DBRs that are out there.
Okay. Some nice comments. Thank you for being here today in the chats and things. But again, we do appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And for our audience, we look forward to having you participate over the next 5 weeks with us. We will be back next Tuesday at 4:30 with Lauren Ivanovich discussing trauma-informed care and restorative practices, as well as Sarah Kupsik and Amanda Whitty, who will be sharing on family, school, and community partnerships. And I know from visiting with Jamie prior to, you are off on a well-deserved family vacation. So thanks again for taking the time to be with us today, and certainly enjoy your time with your family.
Thank you so much. And again, my well wishes for everybody. Our kids need you and our future needs you. So stay safe and stay well. Thank you.